Well, with protocol having been established, I should probably just dive right into my presentation, right? It's certainly a pleasure to be here, and I'm really happy to be able to work along with C.B. Moss and the Maine and Grantstown Advancement Association. You know this is a fantastic inaugural event, but you know that we're not, by the very name inaugural, that means you're planning to have more, right? So, of course, this is the first of a wonderful opportunity to really make Emancipation Day a national event. All right, and as you rightly said, to this point, Clark Sill and their community has always held Emancipation Day dear to their heart. But we want to make sure as a university emerges that we also give attention to this very important historic event. Let me say that I'm going to be stealing some ideas from my recently published book. This is not necessarily a sales pitch, but nevertheless, to be fair, it is. So, Freedom and Resistance, a social history of black loyalists in the Bahamas, recently published. We'll take some ideas from it, but I have also expanded in some other interesting areas. I want to begin with a case study of Sarah Moultrie. Sarah Moultrie is an interesting woman that we need to hear more about. And I will begin by saying on April 14th, 1788, a Negro woman calling herself Sarah Moultrie and her child appeared before Dunmore's Negro court, where the Receiver General and two other magistrates pronounced them free. This decision is remarkable given the fact that John Martin Struder, a white loyalist claimant, had appeared and given testimony that challenged Sarah's claim. In his affidavit, Struder revealed the long, hard struggle that Sarah faced as a black woman attempting to claim freedom in Dunmore's Negro court in the Bahamas. According to Struder's testimony, Sarah, at the time of the evacuation of Charleston, South Carolina by His Majesty's troops in 1782, was carried to St. Augustine by Ann Nelson as her lawful property. On moving to the Bahamas, Ann Nelson brought the said woman with her. Sarah was eventually given to Struder as a free gift shortly before Ann Nelson embarked for England. Attempting to make a profit from his newly acquired property, Struder in turn sold Sarah to Hugh Dean, a notorious slave auctioneer in New Providence. Undoubtedly, Sarah's brief appearance in the court and her own life story is shrouded by the fact that it is told from the perspective of Struder, a white privileged male. To recapture Sarah's struggle, it is necessary to work against the grain of this official narrative and unpack the gender and racial assumptions embedded in this historical record. Sarah's story was tragic from the start. We can imagine she most likely entered into the official narrative once she fled to the British lines in Charleston. Despite the likelihood that she possessed a certificate of freedom, she was illegally re-enslaved, most likely claimed as confiscated property, and evacuated by Ann Nelson to St. Augustine by 1782. Apparently, Sarah not only escaped from Hugh Dean's plantation, but also sought refuge with Lord Dunmore at his plantation, where she worked as a cook until her case could be brought before the courts. But even before an official trial date was established, Struder made numerous applications to have Sarah removed by force or persuasion from Dunmore's plantation. Yet in every instance, Sarah appeared determined to be free. Struder himself confessed this much when he noted that on one occasion when he visited Dunmore, he was told Sarah says she was free. Sarah's story tells us much about the journey from Africa to the Bahamas that many enslaved persons were forced to traverse. Ira Berlin, a noted historian from the University of Maryland, formalized a concept called the Atlantic Creoles. And in this concept, he argued that the Atlantic Creole was a culturally dexterous individual that had to often navigate multiple imperial systems during the period of enslavement. And so these individuals often could speak more than one language. They were able to navigate legal systems. They were able to cross borders and adapt to different plantation societies. And so we see in Sarah an example of an Atlantic Creole, someone who crossed from the 13 colonies to Spanish Florida and then on to the Bahamas, a non-plantation slave-holding society. And so she demonstrates the dexterity and the culturally conversant skills that a lot of these Atlantic Creoles possessed in an evolving Atlantic world. Indeed, she had great political acumen. But this story also tells us about a notion of what I would like to suggest is transculturation. Historians used to talk about acculturation, or a more backward term might be seasoning. This whole process by which the African became American or the African became Bahamian. And when they talked about it, it almost appeared as if it was some kind of linear progression from being African to somehow being Bahamian. Well, we know that's not true because in truth, as the great Cuban anthropologist Fernando Ortiz has shared, this process was far from linear or one-dimensional. In fact, it was quite complex and multifarious. In fact, he argues that the complexity was not one-dimensional but multidimensional, and one can in fact maintain your Africanness even while you moved into a new territory or crossed colonial boundaries. And so I suggest that Sarah's story speaks to a transculturation process by which she adapted quite well to a new environment, even as she faced serious racial boundaries and, of course, the dominating force of the plantation complex. Sarah was not alone, mind you, in this kind of process. I share with you, just as an aside, the case or the journey of old Mrs. Wallace. She was described in Dawson's journal in 1817 as a pupil of Joseph Paul. Now, Joseph Paul is a notorious figure because he established the first school for free blacks in the Bahamas, located in Delancey Town, just north of Bangtown, right across Meeting Street. And anyways, in this school we had a pupil named Old Miss Wallace. And she was described by the Methodist Society as a woman who had a maiden name, Faulkner, but Dawson also revealed that she was born among the Igbo in Africa. So from West African origins, Wallace managed to traverse the Atlantic, being first brought to Jamaica, then to Pensacola, then to Charleston, then to St. Augustine, and then finally to Nassau. Boy, if they had frequent flyer miles back then, she could have heard that, right? But even as Wallace eventually took on this maiden name of Faulkner and clearly became integrated into a Creolized community in Nassau, she was still known by her African ethnic identity, evident in Dawson's reference to her Igbo origins. So such interwoven identities underscore the way in which Atlantic Creoles and black loyalists would have been counted as such. They navigated complex worlds based on relationships with other Africans, African Americans, and even whites of varying classes and social strata. And like Sarah Moultrie, Wallace as an Igbo woman would have traversed various host societies where, despite her nominal education, her blackness would have undoubtedly consigned her to a racially subordinate position, particularly as she encountered white slaveholders in various Atlantic world seaports. And we must never forget that transculturation, while it operated in a sort of multidimensional realm, it was also asymmetrical, meaning that there was always a power structure in which a white slaveholder tried to maximize the labor and maintain control of a hegemonic system in which they were, of course, in control of the economic and social machinery of that colony. And so she would have experienced racism. She would have experienced efforts to gain freedom through whatever means she could, but being denied opportunities because of the legal, social, and economic systems that she encountered. Sarah's struggle for freedom is also important for understanding overriding gender assumptions regarding the efficacy of a woman's testimony in a court of law. While the presence of women in courts throughout New England was progressively rare, the appearance of Sarah and other women in Nassau's courtrooms suggested a political opening that flowed against the tide of legal practices in the Anglo-American world. Although courts in New England and across the eastern seaboard of the United States were foreclosing participation of black women and other non-whites in courtrooms, it appears that in other locales across the Atlantic world, inclusive of Spanish Florida and Cuba, loyalists and others were able to use the judicial space to expand or at least continue to gain opportunities to present their case for freedom. So this is what Sarah did when she went before the court in the Bahamas, opened by Lord Dunmore. And in these courts, we have a kind of political theater developing, where you had white claimants coming in, claiming that these persons were their property, their chattel. And on the other hand, you had black loyalists coming before the courts with certificates of freedom, as Sarah did, saying, I am free, and this certificate is telling you that I am free. And so you had some kind of a contest taking place in a way that was certainly drama for that period in time. What has happened to... Yeah, thank you, sir. Appreciate it. For a second there, I almost thought that was BTL. Yes. I've done that before, by the way. The other area that I think Sarah's case is important is looking at resistance. And I'm going to spend the last bit of the time that I have up here really talking about resistance in a broader context. Sarah clearly demonstrates the way in which black loyalists used Dunmore's Negro Court and other venues to advance their claims to freedom. Though Sarah's actual testimony was never recorded, and despite never penning a petition, her actions, her praxis before the trial and her presence in the courtroom indicates a person who was acutely aware of her rights to freedom. Like other black loyalists, Sarah used her recently acquired status as a British subject to demand that her case be heard before the court of law. Indeed, seeking refuge on Dunmore's plantation and utilizing the court and legal system, demonstrated the political acumen that Sarah had in not only recognizing the limits that were placed before her as a woman, but also seeing the opportunities that these courts and other contested spaces afforded her. But Sarah really was not unique in this way, because Sarah's actions, like many other laboring, enslaved, and free blacks at that time, speak to a maturing political consciousness, one that was forged in the crucible of slavery and directed against the system that bound them to oppressive conditions and denied them rights as subject citizens. Let's now consider a few other agitators for freedom. And we don't like to use this nomenclature, but I think we absolutely need to. And that is, we need to refer to them now as black abolitionists. And they need to be given far more credit than the white abolitionists have been given for some time. Anyways, let's proceed. Black Dick was an amazing person in brandishing a gun and courageously firing it at his enslaver on Hunter's plantation in Cat Island. He sent out a clarion call for freedom. And then there's Alec and Matilda, who likewise refused to acquiesce to the demands of Farquharson's son on San Salvador. More known to us, of course, is Pompey and his collaborators, who were unwilling to remain quiescent once Lord Rolls' plans for removing them from Exuma became news. Reflecting a growing awareness of his political rights, Pompey not only took a dinghy, or stole it, and sailed to Nassau, where he figured he might have a favorable hearing with a sympathetic abolitionist in the person of James Carmichael Smith. Now, the outcome was horrible, that they were flogged and they were forcibly removed back to Exuma. Let's not forget that these actions reflect a man and a group of people that had great determination and political acumen. That they knew exactly where to go and how to navigate from Exuma to Nassau speaks volumes to that. And even if Smith really wasn't much of an abolitionist, and we can debate that, at least they had the sense to know that that was the best place you could possibly go to have their case heard. And then we turn to Eleuthera. In 1833, on Johnson's estate in Eleuthera, news of impending freedom led enslaved persons to assert that they were free. Refusing to work, and thereby forcing magistrates and soldiers of the 2nd West Indian Regiment to intervene with promises of improved working conditions. All of these cases taken together, the sum total, I would argue, tells us that there was a process of political awakening that did not occur in a vacuum, but was shaped by the politics of the Black Atlantic in the age of revolutions. Significantly, both free blacks and enslaved rebels of this formative period of rebellion were acutely aware of the activities taking place in the Atlantic world, to the point where they could direct their self-assertiveness towards those who could most readily remedy their situation. And I want to say that even as I've been talking mostly about collective resistance, we often sometimes forget the quotidian, the day-to-day kind of resistance that took place in the small places and spaces that these persons occupied. That oftentimes we find in going to the marketplace, growing one's own crops, making a living, a life of your own outside of the rigors of enslavement. And even if we might have had a task instead of a gang system where people would have said at least the conditions materially were better, understand that the codes that guided their very lives were still very oppressive. And so they found unique and creative ways to adapt to the situation they were forced to live in. And it was that creative adaptation that speaks to the spirit of the Bahamian, the ability to make the most out of nothing, the ability to, even when you're at the end of your rope, they always say, well, time longer than rope. Yes, and so you always find a way to make the most even out of the worst situation. And so I speak also to those proto-peasants in Exuma and Long Island and other places who found the land that they were given, whether rocky or difficult to farm, they still found the holes and the caves and the potholes and places that they could farm, and they used their ingenuity to farm. And where they could not farm, CB, they went out to sea. In fact, Pompey clearly was a navigator, a sailor, and oftentimes he would go out for weeks sailing and fishing and doing the things that he could do to make a life of his own. And so as I end this presentation, let me just say that we must not forget the multiple ways in which enslaved persons found a way to make sense out of the place that they were placed in. And we cannot forget that these persons were the true abolitionists. I say that because white abolitionists from the start were all about reform. The passing of the 1807 abolition of the Slave Trade Act was not to abolish slavery, it was to reform slavery and get rid of the most hideous element of it, the Middle Passage. But right up until the 1820s, they were all about amelioration, improving the conditions, not abolishing slavery. Slavery was abolished because of the actions of enslaved persons throughout the Caribbean. I want to make that point strong. If it were not for Pompey, and if it were not for Dick, and if it were not for Sam Sharp in Jamaica, if it were not for these individuals who are saying you could reform the system all you want, but the system itself is inherently evil and needs to go and go now. If it were not for them making those demands through their praxis, through their actions, I would argue to you today, abolition would not have occurred in 1834. And full emancipation certainly would not have occurred in 1838. It was the black abolitionists in the Bahamas and the greater circum-Caribbean region that made abolition possible when it occurred. Let us not forget that. It is okay to talk about William Wilberforce.
That's right.
It's okay to talk about Thomas Clarkson.
That's
You
right.
can even mention Granville Sharp.
That's right.
But you must now bring into the conversation our black abolitionists and let us place them on the rightful pedestal that they believe they deserve to be placed. Thank you very much.
The more I read and study African history, the prouder I have become as a descendant of Africans. Because as Professor said, it was not the white or the European abolitionists, it was actually our own people. Let's talk about Elijah Morris. Is anyone here from Gambia? Gambia, we were expecting, yes, Gambia. Elijah Morris was a slave. He was on board a ship leaving Virginia, traveling to New Orleans to be sold. But 153 of them on board. And along with 19 other slaves, they overpowered the captain and the crew, took possession of the ship, sailed it to Nassau. They were sent to Gambia by James Carmichael Smith, the governor then, and that resistance on their part, they attempted to prosecute him for that act, which is known as the largest slave uprising in the southern U.S. history. But he needs to be venerated. I mean, listen, you go into Gambia today, and they are descendants, direct descendants of Elijah Morris in Gambia. These are the people. And if we had not studied history and worked not for people like Professor Curry, we would not know this. And it gives me a great sense of pride when I reflect on those warriors.